Hey, dear restless mind tonight. We step through the crimson gates of China's forbidden city, where shadows hold more authority than thrones. The year is 1620, and the air inside the imperial palace hangs thick, with sandalwood incense and unspoken conspiracies. You hear the soft shuffle of silk slippers on marble floors, the distant chime of bronze bells marking another hour in the endless night. Lantern light flickers across lacquered pillars painted dragon red, casting long shadows that seem to breathe. Somewhere behind those walls, an emperor sits alone, but he's not truly in charge. The real power belongs to the men who cannot father children, the men who sacrificed everything to stand where ministers could never reach. Tonight, you will understand why Chinese eunuchs became more powerful than the emperors they supposedly served. And honestly, if you'd been born in Imperial China with ambitions beyond your station, you probably would not have survived the first step of this journey. The price of admission was something most would never willingly pay. If this story of palace intrigue and shadowy power grips you, subscribe now and let the mysteries of history lull you towards sleep. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight and what time your clock shows. Whether you rest in Shanghai at midnight or drift off in London at dusk, we share these ancient corridors together. Now settle deeper into your pillow, let your breathing slow, and allow the whispers of the Forbidden City to carry you away. You stand outside the Meridian Gate, the main southern entrance to the Forbidden City in Beijing. The year does not matter, pick any century between 200 BCE and 1900 CE, and this scene remains eerily similar. You're a young man from a poor village, perhaps 12 years old, perhaps 16. Your family has nothing. The land produces dust. Your father owes debts he cannot repay, and someone has told you about a path into the palace, a guaranteed position serving the emperor himself. Steady meals, silk clothing, perhaps even wealth beyond imagination. There is only one requirement, and it is non-negotiable. You must surrender your manhood. The procedure happens in a small hut outside the palace walls, run by men who have performed this operation thousands of times. They call themselves knifers, and they work with terrifying efficiency. You pay them, or your family pays them, a fee for their services. They will also preserve what they remove in a sealed jar, because you will need that jar later. Without it, you cannot be promoted. Without it, you cannot be buried whole. The operation takes minutes. The recovery takes months. Roughly 3 out of every 10 boys who undergo this procedure die from infection, blood loss, or shock. You lie on a heated brick bed called a kang, forbidden to drink water for 3 days despite the burning thirst that consumes you. If you survive, you belong to the palace now. This is the first truth you must understand about eunuch power. It was purchased with irreversible sacrifice. Every single eunuch who ever whispered in an emperor's ear, who ever commanded armies or executed rivals or toppled dynasties, had first submitted to this knife. They had crossed a threshold that no scholar official, no general, no prince would ever cross. And this gave them something priceless. Access. You see, the Forbidden City was not just a palace. It was a fortress designed to protect the emperor's bloodline. Thousands of women lived within those walls. Empresses, consorts, concubines, and servant girls. The emperor was the only intact male permitted in the inner quarters. Any other man who entered risked death, and more importantly, risked contaminating the imperial lineage. How could anyone be certain that a prince was truly the emperor's son if random men wandered through the harem? This paranoia shaped everything. Ministers, generals, and advisors could approach the outer halls. They could kneel in audience chambers and present their memorials. But they could not follow the emperor into his private world. They waited outside locked gates while eunuchs walked freely within. Imagine the advantage this created. The emperor wakes in the morning, and who brings him his tea? A eunuch. He reads his documents, and who holds the candle? A eunuch. He argues with his empress, and who pretends not to listen while memorizing every word? A eunuch. He falls ill and whispers his fears about mortality, and who stands beside his bed through the long night? A eunuch. The relationship was intimate in ways that no minister could replicate. Eunuchs dressed the emperor. They bathed him when he was a child. They carried him through corridors, selected his meals, and monitored his health. They knew his habits, his weaknesses, his secret vices. They were furniture that listened, walls that remembered, shadows that schemed. The system began long before the Forbidden City existed. As early as the Shang dynasty, over 3,000 years ago, records mention castrated servants in royal households. By the Han dynasty, around 200 BCE, eunuchs had become institutionalized. The Tang dynasty employed thousands. The Ming dynasty, which built the Forbidden City, swelled the eunuch population to an almost absurd degree. At certain points, over 100,000 eunuchs served the imperial household. 100,000 men who could never have families of their own, whose entire identity revolved around the palace, whose only path to meaning was service and advancement within those vermilion walls. This created a peculiar psychology. Eunuchs could not build traditional dynasties. They could not pass wealth to sons. They could not continue their family names through blood. But they could accumulate power during their lifetimes, with a single-minded intensity that frightened everyone around them. What did they have to lose? Their bodies had already paid the ultimate price. Their futures existed only within the palace hierarchy. Every eunuch who rose to prominence did so, knowing that his influence would die with him, which meant he had to use that influence now, completely, without restraint. There was no reason to play long games across generations. There was only this life, this emperor, this moment of leverage. You begin to see the structural problem, do you not? The very mechanism designed to protect the emperor, surrounding him with men who pose no sexual threat, created a new threat entirely. Eunuchs became gatekeepers not just of bedchambers but of information. They controlled physical access to the Son of Heaven. And in a system where the emperor's word was divine law, controlling access to the emperor meant controlling the empire itself. A minister might draft the most brilliant policy proposal in Chinese history, but if the eunuch guarding the emperor's schedule decided that proposal would never reach imperial eyes, it simply vanished. A general might win a crucial victory, but if the eunuch reading battlefield reports chose to emphasize a different general's contributions, the winner received nothing while the favourite was rewarded. The knife that unmade these men also remade them into something new. They entered the Forbidden City as mutilated peasant boys with nothing. Some emerged as the most powerful figures in the largest empire on earth, and the emperors they served, the divine sons of heaven, the rulers of all under the sky, often discovered too late that their loyal servants had become their masters. You now understand the architecture of eunuch power, the sacrifice, the access, the proximity that no outsider could match. But understanding the system is different from watching it devour emperors whole, so let your mind drift backward through the centuries and meet the men who transformed theoretical influence into absolute domination. These are not obscure footnotes in dusty chronicles. These are figures who shaped Chinese history as profoundly as any emperor, and in some cases, far more decisively. Their names still carry a chill in Chinese memory, whispered as warnings about what happens when servants become masters. You find yourself first in the Qin dynasty, around 210 BCE. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, has just unified China for the first time in history. He built the Great Wall. He standardized writing, currency, and measurements. He buried scholars alive for disagreeing with him. This is not a man who tolerates challenges to his authority, and yet when he dies during a tour of his empire, a eunuch named Zhao Gao sees an opportunity that will reshape everything. The emperor's body lies in his carriage, already beginning to rot in the summer heat. Zhao Gao orders cartloads of salted fish to travel alongside the imperial procession, masking the smell of decay. No one outside the innermost circle knows the emperor is dead, and in that window of secrecy, Zhao Gao makes his move. The legitimate heir to the throne is Prince Fusu, a competent and popular figure stationed at the northern frontier. Zhao Gao despises him. He knows that Fusu will never grant him power, will never trust him, will probably dismiss him entirely. So Zhao Gao forges an imperial decree. The document, supposedly written by the dead emperor, orders Prince Fusu to commit suicide for unspecified failures. Fusu, dutiful to the end, obeys the forged command and kills himself. Zhao Gao then installs a weaker prince, Hu Hai, on the throne as the second emperor. This teenager is pliable, pleasure-seeking, and utterly dependent on Zhao Gao's guidance. The eunuch has effectively selected his own puppet. What follows would be almost comedic if it were not so catastrophic. Zhao Gao isolates the young emperor completely, convincing him that appearing in public diminishes imperial majesty. Hu Hai retreats into his palace, surrounded only by eunuchs and entertainers, while Zhao Gao governs in his name. When ministers attempt to report rebellions spreading across the empire, the Qin dynasty is collapsing in real time, Zhao Gao intercepts their messages. He tells the emperor that everything is fine, that these so-called uprisings are merely minor bandit problems. The emperor believes him because the emperor has no other source of information. Zhao Gao has become the only window to the outside world, and he keeps that window painted with whatever scenery suits his purposes. The most famous episode captures Zhao Gao's arrogance perfectly. He brings a deer into the imperial court and presents it to the emperor, calling it a horse. The emperor laughs nervously and says it is obviously a deer. Zhao Gao turns to the assembled ministers and asks them what they see. Those who answer honestly, those who say deer, are later executed. Those who agree with the eunuch, who call the deer a horse against all evidence of their own eyes, survive and are promoted. This is where the Chinese idiom calling a deer a horse originates. It means to deliberately distort the truth through sheer power, and it was invented by a eunuch testing exactly how much reality he could bend. The answer, as it turned out, was everything. He could make the court deny what their eyes told them. The emperor was not the author of truth anymore. Zhao Gao was. Eventually, Zhao Gao grew tired of even this pretense. He forced the second emperor to commit suicide, the second prince he had driven to death, and attempted to claim the throne himself. This finally proved too audacious. He was killed within weeks, but the damage was complete. The Qin dynasty, which was supposed to last 10,000 generations according to its founder, collapsed after just 15 years. A eunuch's manipulation had accelerated its destruction beyond anything external enemies could have achieved. Remember this pattern, you will see it repeat. Now let your mind leap forward roughly 17 centuries to the Ming dynasty and a eunuch named Liu Jin. The year is 1506, and a new emperor has just taken the throne at age 14. The Zhengde emperor, as he will be known, has no interest whatsoever in governing. He wants to play soldier, stage mock battles, keep exotic animals, and pursue women throughout the capital in increasingly scandalous adventures. Liu Jin, his childhood companion and favourite eunuch, is happy to enable all of this, for a price. While the teenage emperor plays, Liu Jin governs. He controls access to the emperor so completely that ministers must submit all proposals through him. He extracts bribes for every appointment, every decision, every audience. He builds a spy network that monitors officials throughout the empire. He promotes his allies and destroys anyone who questions his authority. Liu Jin becomes so powerful that foreign ambassadors address him as the standing emperor, the one who actually rules while the sitting emperor entertains himself. He accumulates wealth on a scale that defies imagination. When he is finally arrested after 8 years of dominance, betrayed by rival eunuchs who fear his power, investigators discover gold and silver worth approximately 250 million ounces in his personal residences. They find armour, weapons, and even forged imperial seals that would allow him to issue decrees indistinguishable from the emperor's own. Whether Liu Jin was actually planning a coup or simply hoarding options remains debated. Either way, the evidence was damning enough. He was executed by slow slicing, a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes, over the course of 3 agonizing days. You might expect that Liu Jin's spectacular downfall would have taught future emperors a lesson about eunuch power. You would be wrong. Just over a century later, the Ming dynasty produced its most infamous eunuch yet, a man whose name remains synonymous with tyranny in Chinese culture, Wei Zhongxian. He rose during the reign of the Tianqi Emperor, who ascended the throne in 1620, the same year where we began this journey, if you recall the sandalwood incense and flickering lanterns. The Tianqi Emperor was not a child, but he might as well have been. His passion was carpentry. He genuinely loved building furniture, and he was apparently quite skilled at it. Unfortunately, building cabinets does not leave much time for building policy. Wei Zhongxian stepped into that void with enthusiasm. Wei Zhongxian had arrived at the palace as an adult, a gambling addict who had castrated himself to escape his debts. This alone marked him as unusual. Most eunuchs were cut as children. He clawed his way upward through palace politics with a combination of charm, brutality and strategic alliances, most notably with the emperor's wet nurse, a powerful woman who shared his ambitions. Together, they gained the young emperor's absolute trust. Wei Zhongxian became the director of the Directorate of Ceremonial, the highest eunuch position, which granted him control over the imperial seal and the right to read all state documents. But he wanted more than bureaucratic authority. He wanted to be worshipped. Across China, officials began building temples to Wei Zhongxian, while he was still alive. Statues depicted him alongside Confucius, an honour so blasphemous that it still shocks historians today. He adopted the title 9,000 years, just one step below the emperor's 10,000 years. His secret police, the Eastern Depot, terrorised the scholar official class. Anyone who criticised him faced arrest, torture and execution. He purged thousands of officials associated with the Donglin Academy, a reform movement that dared to challenge eunuch influence. Their properties were confiscated, their families destroyed, their names erased from official records. Wei Zhongxian did not merely advise the emperor, he replaced him in every meaningful sense. The carpenter on the throne sanded his wood and joined his dovetails, while a former gambling addict with no formal education ruled the largest nation. You have now witnessed the monsters. Zhao Gao with his deer that was a horse, Liu Jin with his mountain of stolen gold, Wei Zhongxian with his blasphemous temples. But focusing only on these extraordinary villains might give you the wrong impression. It might suggest that eunuch power was exceptional, the result of uniquely wicked individuals exploiting uniquely weak emperors. That would be a comforting thought, would it not? Unfortunately, the truth is far more unsettling. Eunuch dominance was not an aberration. It was built into the system itself, encoded in the daily mechanics of how the Chinese Empire actually functioned. Even mediocre eunuchs, men whose names history has forgotten, wielded tools of control that made imperial oversight nearly impossible. Tonight you must understand those tools. You must see how the machinery of power works at its most granular level, because that is where the real capture happened. Not in dramatic throne room confrontations, but in quiet corridors where documents changed hands and information disappeared. Consider the imperial seal. In the Western imagination, a king's power flows from his crown, his throne, his army. In China, it flowed from a carved stone pressed into vermilion ink. The imperial seal transformed paper into law. Without that seal, a document was merely someone's opinion. With it, that same document became the word of heaven itself, to be obeyed without question by every official in the empire. Now ask yourself a simple question. Who physically held the seal? Who carried it from room to room? Who pressed it onto paper? Who stored it overnight? The answer, of course, was eunuchs, specifically eunuchs of the Directorate of Ceremonial, the most powerful organ of the inner court. The emperor might decide to issue an edict, but the edict required the seal to become real, and the seal lived in eunuch hands. This arrangement created possibilities that would make any bureaucrat dizzy with anxiety. A eunuch could delay the sealing of a document, claiming the emperor had not yet approved it. He could seal documents the emperor had never seen, claiming approval had been given privately. He could lose documents entirely, shrugging with theatrical confusion when ministers asked about decisions that somehow never materialized. The emperor theoretically controlled everything, but theory dissolved against the reality of physical custody. You cannot govern an empire through telepathy. You need paper, ink, seals, and messengers. When eunuchs controlled all four, they controlled the interface between imperial will and imperial action. The emperor became a brain without hands, thinking thoughts that never reached the muscles of state. The situation grew even more precarious when emperors were children, and emperors were frequently children because death did not respect the convenience of succession. Emperors died of disease, poison, accidents, and occasionally the interventions of ambitious relatives. Their sons might inherit at age 5, age 8, age 12. A child emperor could not read the sophisticated classical Chinese in which government documents were composed. He could not understand the intricate references to historical precedents that officials used to frame their arguments. He sat on a throne surrounded by paper he could not decipher, dependent entirely on whoever chose to read those documents aloud to him. Eunuchs became interpreters of reality. They could summarize a memorial however they wished, emphasizing certain points while omitting others. They could invent contents entirely, telling the child that a document requested one thing when it actually requested the opposite. The child had no way to verify. He trusted his attendants because they were all he had ever known. This dynamic explains why empress dowagers, the mothers of child emperors, so often allied with eunuchs rather than fighting them. A regent mother faced the same literacy challenge in reverse. She might be educated, but she was confined to the inner palace, forbidden from meeting directly with outer court officials. Her only reliable channel of communication with the government ran through eunuchs. If she wanted information about what ministers were doing, eunuchs told her. If she wanted to issue commands to those ministers, eunuchs carried them. The empress's dowager who fought eunuchs found themselves isolated, their orders mysteriously failing to arrive, their questions mysteriously going unanswered. The empress's dowager who cooperated found themselves with powerful allies who could project their influence beyond palace walls. Mutual dependency flourished. The inner court became a sealed ecosystem where eunuchs and imperial women negotiated power, while the outer court, the realm of educated male officials, knocked futilely at locked gates. Speaking of those gates, let us discuss access control in literal terms. The Forbidden City was not a single building, but a vast complex of halls, courtyards, gardens, and residences. Different areas had different security levels. The outer court, where government business was conducted, admitted officials during working hours. The inner court, where the emperor actually lived, admitted almost no one from outside. Between these zones stood physical barriers, walls, gates, guardhouses, staffed by eunuchs who determined who could pass. An official summoned to imperial audience arrived at a gate and waited. Eunuchs verified his identity, checked the appointment register, and eventually escorted him along approved routes to approved locations. The official saw only what eunuchs chose to show him. He went only where eunuchs chose to lead him. If eunuchs decided the audience was cancelled, the official turned around and went home. He had no recourse because he had no ability to navigate the palace independently. This gatekeeping extended to communication in both directions. When officials submitted memorials, formal policy recommendations, those documents entered the palace through eunuch-controlled channels. Eunuchs logged them, categorized them, and placed them in queues for imperial review. The order of that queue mattered enormously. A memorial seen first thing in the morning, when the emperor was fresh and attentive, received different consideration than one seen late at night after a long day of ceremonies. Eunuchs controlled the order. They could bury urgent messages beneath trivia, ensuring the emperor saw complaints about local grain prices before he saw warnings about approaching invasions. They could accelerate certain documents, creating artificial urgency around issues their allies wanted prioritized. The flow of information was not neutral. It was curated, and the curators had interests of their own. Even physical proximity shaped outcomes in ways officials could not counter. Imagine you were a Grand Secretary, one of the highest officials in the Ming government. You've spent 40 years mastering the Confucian classics, passing examination after examination, climbing the bureaucratic ladder through demonstrated competence. You wish to advise the emperor on a matter of grave importance. You submit your memorial, you wait weeks for the response. Eventually you are granted an audience lasting perhaps 15 minutes. You kneel, You present your case, you answer questions if the emperor has any, then you leave. You might not see the emperor again for months. Meanwhile, the eunuch who brought the emperor his morning tea sees him every single day. The eunuch who helps the emperor dress hears his casual complaints about officials who bore him. The eunuch who guards the bedchamber knows which consort the emperor visited last night, and how that visit affected his mood. Who has more influence? The scholar with his 15 minutes of formal access, or the servant with his 15 hours of informal presence? The question answers itself, and the answer drove scholar officials to despair across dynasty after dynasty. They had prestige, education, and the moral authority of Confucian tradition. Eunuchs had something simpler and more powerful. They were there. They occupied the spaces where decisions actually happened, where emperors thought out loud, where half-formed ideas could be encouraged or quietly discouraged before they ever reached formal expression. By the time an official heard about a new policy, the eunuch had often already shaped it through weeks of subtle commentary. You begin to see why reformers repeatedly tried to limit eunuch numbers and functions, and why those reforms repeatedly failed. The problem was not that emperors loved eunuchs. Many emperors found them annoying, grasping, or untrustworthy. The problem was that emperors needed them. Someone had to staff the inner palace. Someone had to carry the seal, manage the documents, guard the gates, tend to the imperial person. Officials could not do it without violating every security protocol that protected the dynasty. Women could not do it without creating confusion about their roles. Eunuchs were the only option, and once they were inside, the logic of proximity took over. They accreted power the way a river accretes silt, slowly, invisibly, until one day you notice the landscape has completely changed. You look for the channel where authority once flowed and find it buried under the accumulated sediment of 1,000 small advantages exploited over 1,000 quiet days. You now grasp the mechanics, the seals, the documents, the gates, the quiet accumulation of advantage through proximity. But power in a vacuum means nothing. Power only matters when it collides with rival power, and the eunuchs of imperial China faced a formidable rival indeed. The scholar official class, the Confucian bureaucracy that considered itself the rightful brain of the empire. These were men who had sacrificed their youth to memorization, who had competed in examinations so brutal that success rates often fell below 1%, who believed with religious conviction that educated virtue should guide the state. They looked at eunuchs and saw everything they despised: uneducated servants, physically mutilated, morally suspect, wielding influence they had not earned through merit. The scholar officials believed they deserved to advise emperors. Eunuchs, in their view, deserved to carry chamber pots. This mutual contempt erupted across centuries into one of the longest and bloodiest power struggles in Chinese history. Tonight you walk through that battlefield and you will find it littered with the corpses of men who thought righteousness would protect them. The conflict was structural before it was personal. Confucian philosophy taught that government should be conducted by gentlemen scholars who cultivated moral wisdom through study and reflection. The examination system existed to identify these superior men and elevate them to positions of responsibility. A proper official earned his place through demonstrated mastery of classical texts, through essays that revealed both intellectual sophistication and ethical depth. He represented the outer court, the realm of formal governance, where policy was debated according to established procedures and historical precedents. Eunuchs represented something else entirely. They had not passed examinations. They had not studied the classics, or if they had done so informally, without the credentials that mattered. They belonged to the inner court, the domestic sphere, where their duties theoretically involved household management rather than state affairs. When eunuchs influenced policy, scholar officials saw it as a category violation, a collapse of proper boundaries, a symptom of dynastic decay. The eunuchs, unsurprisingly, saw things differently. From their perspective, scholar officials were arrogant hypocrites who preached virtue while pursuing self-interest, who lectured about loyalty while forming factions to advance their own careers. Officials came and went with appointments and retirements. Eunuchs remained year after year, emperor after emperor, They knew the palace in ways no outsider could. They understood which policies would please the current emperor and which would irritate him. They watched officials blunder through audiences, giving tone-deaf advice that ignored the emperor's actual personality and preferences. If eunuchs exercised influence, it was because they had earned it through intimate knowledge, through service, through being genuinely useful rather than merely credentialed. The examination system tested whether you could write pretty essays about ancient sages. It did not test whether you could navigate the treacherous waters of court politics without drowning yourself and everyone around you. This mutual hostility might have remained a cold war of sneers and snubs, if not for one crucial factor. Emperors often preferred eunuchs to officials. This seems counterintuitive until you remember what it actually felt like to be an emperor. You're surrounded from birth by people who want something from you. Ministers want policies approved. Generals want campaigns funded. Relatives want titles and estates. Everyone who approaches you formally has an agenda, and that agenda rarely prioritizes your personal comfort or happiness. Eunuchs, by contrast, attended to your human needs. They brought you food when you were hungry. They told you jokes when you were bored. They kept your secrets when you misbehaved. Many emperors formed genuine emotional bonds with the eunuchs who had raised them. Bonds that no pompous official could replicate by quoting Confucius at them. When an emperor had to choose between his childhood companion and some stranger demanding he work harder, the choice was often easy. Scholar officials understood this disadvantage and resented it bitterly. Their response across multiple dynasties was to frame eunuch influence as a moral emergency requiring drastic countermeasures. They wrote memorials denouncing eunuch corruption in the most dramatic terms. They formed alliances and academies dedicated to purifying the government of inner court contamination. They positioned themselves as defenders of orthodox governance against creeping palace despotism. Sometimes these campaigns succeeded briefly. More often they provoked devastating retaliation. Eunuchs who felt threatened did not write philosophical treatises in response. They used the tools they had, access to the emperor, control over information, and when necessary, the secret police. The Eastern Depot deserves special attention here because it represents eunuch power at its most terrifying. Established in 1420 during the Ming Dynasty, the Eastern Depot was an intelligence and security agency staffed entirely by eunuchs and answering directly to the emperor through the Directorate of Ceremonial. Its official purpose was to investigate corruption, treason, and other threats to the throne. Its practical purpose was to monitor everyone, officials, generals, merchants, commoners, and report anything suspicious to the palace. Eastern Depot agents operated throughout the capital and beyond, dressed in civilian clothes, listening in tea houses and marketplaces, cultivating informants, building files on anyone who might someday need to be destroyed. If you were an official in Ming Beijing and you complained about eunuch influence at a private dinner party, there was a reasonable chance that one of your dinner companions would report your comments by morning. The Western Depot, established later, was even worse, a secret police agency created to watch the secret police, answering to especially favoured eunuchs who wanted their own independent source of coercion. At various points, these agencies conducted mass arrests based on vague accusations, tortured confessions out of prisoners using methods that would violate every modern convention, and executed people without meaningful trials. When Wei Zhongxian, remember him, with his temples and his 9,000 years, targeted the Donglin Academy reformers, the Eastern Depot served as his weapon. Agents arrested Donglin affiliates across the empire. They applied devices with names like the Cage and the Press to extract the testimonies they needed. Prisoners died in custody or emerged broken, ready to implicate anyone the eunuchs named. The death toll reached into the thousands. Entire networks of officials, their families, their students, their associates, were swept away in purges that decapitated the reform movement for a generation. You might wonder why emperors permitted this. The answer is that emperors often had no idea what was happening, or they approved because eunuchs had persuaded them that officials were the real threat. Remember the information control we discussed earlier? Eunuchs shaped what emperors knew. They presented officials as conspirators, as power-hungry schemers who wanted to limit imperial authority and rule through bureaucratic manipulation. There was enough truth in this characterization to make it plausible. Scholar officials did want to limit imperial authority. They called it governing through established institutions, rather than governing through personal whim. They did form factions that pursued collective interests. From a paranoid emperor's perspective, eunuchs warning about official conspiracies sounded more credible than officials warning about eunuch conspiracies. At least the eunuchs could not start their own dynasties. The tragedy for scholar officials was that their very integrity often worked against them. Confucian ethics demanded that officials speak truth to power, that they remonstrate with rulers who strayed from virtue, that they accept punishment rather than compromise their principles. This made them predictable. When a eunuch consolidated power, righteous officials would inevitably submit memorials criticizing him. Those memorials provided target lists. The officials who remained silent were noted as potential collaborators. The officials who protested were noted as enemies to be purged when convenient. Eunuchs learned to provoke criticism deliberately, flushing out opponents who could then be accused of factionalism or disloyalty. Moral courage became a trap. The officials who best exemplified Confucian virtue were often the first to die when eunuchs decided to clean house. Not every confrontation ended in eunuch victory, of course. History remembers moments when coalitions of officials successfully impeached powerful eunuchs, when new emperors dismantled the networks their predecessors had tolerated. Liu Jin was executed. Wei Zhongqian was driven to suicide when his imperial patron died, and a reforming emperor took the throne. But these victories were temporary. The structural conditions that produced eunuch power remained intact. Within years or decades, new eunuchs rose to fill the vacuum, often because the next emperor was a child or weak, or simply uninterested in the exhausting work of governing through proper channels. Officials won battles. Eunuchs won the war over and over until the war consumed the dynasties themselves. The pattern teaches something bleak about institutional conflict. The side with daily access defeats the side with formal authority. The side that controls information defeats the side that generates it. The side willing to use violence through secret police defeats the side constrained by ethical principles. Scholar officials had tradition, education, and moral philosophy. Eunuchs had the emperor's ear, the imperial seal, and the eastern depot. It was never a fair fight. It was never intended to be. You have witnessed the machinery of eunuch power, the blood-soaked conflicts with scholar officials, the secret police networks and torture chambers, but perhaps you still wonder whether this truly mattered in the grand arc of Chinese history. Surely these were palace dramas, contained within red walls, ultimately peripheral to the real forces that shaped empires. Tonight that comfortable illusion must die. Eunuchs did not merely influence Chinese history, they ended it repeatedly. The Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, three of China's greatest imperial achievements, all collapsed in significant part because eunuchs had rotted them from within. When dynasties fell, millions died in the resulting chaos. Warlords carved the empire into bleeding fragments. Foreign invaders poured through undefended borders, and at the centre of each catastrophe you find eunuchs who had grown so powerful that destroying them required destroying everything around them. This is not hyperbole. This is documented fact, written in chronicles that count corpses by the 100,000. Begin with the Han Dynasty, which lasted over 4 centuries and established the template for Chinese governance that would persist for 2 millennia. By the 2nd century CE, the later Han period, eunuchs had achieved something remarkable. They had made themselves hereditary. Not biologically, of course, that remained impossible. But eunuchs adopted sons, usually young relatives who were then castrated and brought into palace service. These adopted sons inherited not just property but positions, connections and protection networks. Eunuch families became political dynasties in their own right, passing power across artificial generations. They controlled the secretariat, which managed palace administration. They dominated the imperial guards. They placed allies throughout the provincial governments. The emperor had become almost decorative, a ritual figure who performed ceremonies while eunuchs made actual decisions. In 168 CE, a group of students and officials attempted to break this stranglehold through what history calls the partisan prohibitions. They compiled lists of corrupt eunuchs and their collaborators. They organised demonstrations. They demanded reform. The eunuch response was swift and merciless. Using accusations of sedition, they arrested hundreds of reformers. Those not executed were banned from government service, along with their families, their students, and anyone associated with their movement. The prohibition lasted nearly 20 years, removing an entire generation of potential officials from public life. The bureaucracy, already weakened, began to collapse. Tax collection failed. Military discipline evaporated. Regional commanders started ignoring central authority, because central authority had become a joke. Then, in 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted. Hundreds of thousands of peasants, driven to desperation by corruption and economic collapse, rose in a messianic uprising that promised to replace the Han with a new heaven on earth. The imperial government could not respond effectively because the imperial government barely functioned. Eunuchs and officials were too busy fighting each other to fight the rebels. Regional warlords stepped into the vacuum, raising private armies that supposedly defended the dynasty, but actually carved out independent territories. In 189 CE, a general named Yuan Shao decided that eunuchs were the root problem. He launched a palace coup, and on a single night, over 2,000 eunuchs were slaughtered in the capital. Every male servant who could not immediately prove he was intact was killed on suspicion. Blood ran in palace gutters. The surviving eunuchs fled or went into hiding. But removing eunuchs did not restore the dynasty. It was too late for that. The warlords who had mobilized to save the empire now fought each other for control. The Han dynasty formally ended in 220 CE, fragmenting into 3 warring kingdoms. The population, which had reached nearly 60 million at the dynasty's height, fell to perhaps 16 million through war, famine, and plague. 2/3 of China's people vanished in the chaos that followed eunuch domination. The survivors would remember this lesson, but they would not learn from it. 4 centuries later, it happened again. The Tang dynasty represented Chinese civilization at its absolute apex. This was the age of Li Bai's poetry, a Buddhist philosophy's golden period, of international trade routes that connected China to Persia and Byzantium. The capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million residents. And by the late 8th century it was all starting to crack under eunuch pressure. The turning point came with a series of military disasters that seemed unconnected to palace politics, but were actually symptoms of the same disease. When eunuchs controlled information and access, military commanders could not communicate effectively with emperors. Strategic decisions were delayed, distorted, or made by people who had never seen a battlefield. The Anlishan Rebellion of 755 CE, one of history's deadliest conflicts, erupted partly because eunuchs had prevented accurate intelligence about brewing military discontent from reaching the throne. After that rebellion was finally suppressed, at a cost of 36 million lives, if medieval records can be trusted, eunuchs paradoxically emerged stronger than before. The Tang emperors, traumatized by military betrayal, turned to eunuchs as a counterweight to their generals. Eunuchs were placed in command of palace armies, elite units that protected the capital. This gave them something they had never possessed before: direct military power. By the 9th century, eunuchs were not just influencing which emperor sat on the throne. They were actively installing and deposing emperors through armed force. Between 820 and 904 CE, eunuchs murdered 2 emperors directly and forced at least 3 others to abdicate. One emperor, Wenzong, described himself as less powerful than his weakest Han dynasty predecessor, a remarkable admission from the theoretical ruler of the Middle Kingdom. The sweet dew incident of 835 CE demonstrates how completely the relationship had inverted. Emperor Wenzong and his officials planned to eliminate the dominant eunuch faction by luring them into a trap. They reported that miraculous sweet dew had appeared on a pomegranate tree, an auspicious omen that required immediate investigation. When the eunuchs arrived to see this wonder, soldiers would be waiting to kill them. The plot failed catastrophically. The eunuchs detected the ambush, mobilized their palace armies, and launched a counterpurge that killed approximately 1,000 officials and their families. They displayed their heads on pikes throughout the capital. The emperor watched helplessly as his supporters were butchered in his own throne room. He spent the remaining years of his reign as a prisoner in his palace, forbidden to meet with officials without eunuch supervision. By 904 CE, the Tang dynasty had become a puppet show that no one bothered to watch anymore. Regional military governors had stopped pretending to obey imperial commands. When the warlord Zhu Wen decided to establish his own dynasty, he first eliminated the eunuch problem in typically direct fashion. He ordered every eunuch in the capital killed, perhaps 3,000 men, then formally deposed the last Tang emperor. China shattered into the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a maze of short-lived states that fought with each other for half a century. Once again, eunuch dominance had so weakened central authority that the empire could not survive their removal. The Ming dynasty, which you have already encountered through Liu Jin and Wei Zhongxian, represents the ultimate evolution of eunuch power. By the late Ming period, the Directorate of Ceremonial had grown into a parallel government more powerful than the official one. Eunuchs operated their own courts, which could override decisions by the Ministry of Justice. They controlled their own treasury, funded by commerce monopolies and illegal taxes. They commanded armies, negotiated with foreign powers, and appointed officials to provincial posts. The Confucian bureaucracy still existed, still conducted examinations, still submitted memorials, but it had become ceremonial, elaborate theatrical performance that everyone recognized as meaningless. Real power lay with whichever eunuch faction currently controlled the emperor. When the Manchus invaded from the north in 1644, the Ming dynasty could not mount an effective defense. The army was demoralized and underfunded because eunuchs had embezzled military budgets. Officials who might have organized resistance were dead or discredited from decades of purges. The last Ming emperor found himself almost alone in his palace, abandoned by courtiers who saw no point in defending a hollow dynasty. According to legend, he climbed Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City, looked out at rebel armies approaching his capital, and hanged himself from a tree. A eunuch named Wang Chengen followed him in death, one of the few who remained loyal to the end. It was a fitting conclusion, the emperor and the eunuch dying together in the gardens of the empire they had destroyed between them. The Manchus who established the Qing dynasty looked at this history and reached an obvious conclusion. The eunuch system could not be reformed. It could only be abolished. They reduced eunuch numbers from tens of thousands to a few hundred. They forbade eunuchs from handling government documents, from learning to read and write, from leaving the palace without permission. They turned eunuchs back into what they had originally been, domestic servants with no path to political power. The system that had shaped Chinese governance for 2 millennia ended not with grand reform but with foreign conquerors who simply refused to play the game. And perhaps that was the only way it could have ended. The indigenous dynasties had proven themselves incapable of breaking the cycle. It took outsiders, unburdened by tradition, to say the simple truth. This does not work. This has never worked. This destroys everything it touches. As your mind drifts through these centuries of catastrophe, as you count the dynasties that fell and the millions who died, remember that each collapse began with something seemingly minor. A eunuch who carried the imperial seal, a servant who whispered to a child emperor, a guardian of the bedchamber who decided which ministers the emperor would see today. Power accumulated in drops, in tiny advantages multiplied across decades, until suddenly the accumulation reached critical mass and everything shattered. The emperor sat on his throne, but the throne had been hollowed out from beneath, eaten away by the very servants who polished it each morning. When the final crisis came, a rebellion, an invasion, a fiscal collapse, there was nothing left but gilded wreckage waiting to fall. Now, as we reach the end of this dark journey through palace corridors, let your breathing slow. The lanterns of the Forbidden City grow dim, their light softening to amber, then to rust, then to shadow. The eunuchs and emperors fade into historical memory, their struggles concluded, their dynasties dust. You're safe in your bed, far from secret police and palace coups, free from the terrible mathematics of proximity and power. The silk slippers no longer whisper on marble floors. The bronze bells have stopped their counting of fatal hours. What remains is only the lesson, written in blood across 3,000 years, that power corrupts not just those who hold it, but the very structures designed to contain it. The eunuchs are gone now, their knives shattered, their influence ended. But somewhere, in different forms with different names, servants still stand closer to power than those who supposedly rule, and proximity still works its ancient alchemy, transforming the lowest into the highest, the weakest into the strongest, until the next dynasty falls and the cycle begins again. Let these thoughts dissolve now into the approaching darkness. Let the last emperor close his eyes. Let the palace walls crumble into peaceful nothing. Tomorrow will bring its own light, its own stories, its own gentle tyrannies. But tonight you rest, whole and safe, while history's shadows lose their sharp edges and become the soft geography of dreams. Sweet dreams,